When people think of science fiction, they don't think of a 19th century Victorian female author as being the modern mother of the genre that we've all come to know and love. In fact, people might think of H.G. Wells or Jules Verne before they'll think of Mary Shelley. And when people think of Frankenstein, they're more inclined to think of Boris Karloff in a horror movie as opposed to a science fiction novel. But let me introduce you to the woman behind the creation of science fiction. Mary Shelley, born Mary Wollstonecraft, is born on August the 30th of 1797, and she dies on February 1st, 1851. She's the daughter of William Godwin, who is a political writer and philosopher who was well known, philosophically speaking, for the inquiry concerning the principles of political justice and its influence on general virtue and happiness, published in 1793. But he's also the author of a very early crime novel called Caleb Williams, which is published in 1794. Her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was a well-established feminist writer during that time period, particularly noted for A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft had a daughter named Fanny from her previous marriage, and while she's pregnant with Mary, she winds up contracting puerperal fever, and shortly after Mary is born, she winds up dying from it. Now, William Godwin would remarry a woman by the name of Mary Jane Clairmont, who brings two children from her previous marriage. Their children's names are Charles and Jane. Jane goes by the nickname of Claire as well. And Mary never got along very well with Mary Jane because of the fact that Mary Jane did not treat all of the children equally. In fact, Mary Jane would deny Mary and Fanny an education while she would allow Charles and Claire to go ahead and be educated. And I guess some of that was a little bit of a superiority complex, thinking that her children that were born of her own flesh were more worthy than Mary and Fanny would be. So there was sort of this second-class citizenship, so to speak, within this family structure. And this created a big problem. This created a lot of tension between Mary and Mary Jane. It got to the point where when Mary was 13 years old, she would start developing these psychosomatic skin boils anytime she was in the room with her stepmother. And then once the two of them were separated, then things were fine. The skin boils went away. And William steps in because he realizes this isn't good. This is not making for a happy marriage nor a happy father-daughter relationship. And he reconciles it by sending Mary away to go stay with a friend in Scotland by the name of William Baxter. Now, when she returns to London some years later, William Godwin has taken in a young man by the name of Percy Shelley, whom he's grooming to be this new and upcoming writer and poet. And Mary is immediately attracted to Percy. And within 2 months, they've become lovers. And then the two of them run off to France together, and for some reason, they take Claire with them. And the two of them are officially married. Mary and Percy wind up being married on December the 29th of 1816. Now, Mary and Percy would have a very rocky relationship. And this questions why Claire went with them, but later on, she winds up having an affair with Percy. And it wouldn't be the only time that Percy would prove to be unfaithful. In fact, infidelity might as well have been his middle name. And Mary became quite accustomed to the fact that Percy was going to be running around with someone. Now, when we think of the Shelleys, the word that often comes to mind is the word taboo. And there are a lot of them. Right, first of all, an unwed couple running off to France together, that's a taboo. But add to that the fact that Percy was already married to a Harriet Wisterbrook, and he neglects her, and the fact that she's pregnant, she's carrying their unborn child at this particular point. So Harriet retaliates and creates 2 taboos to go along with that. She drowns herself, she jumps into the Serpentine River, while she's carrying the child. So it's bad enough that she commits suicide. That's taboo number 1. Taboo number 2, she kills her unborn child in the process. So already there's something sort of cursed about this relationship. It falls under bad circumstances right away. Now, Part of the reason why Mary falls in love with Percy is because apparently Percy reminded her of her own father. And maybe this is sort of a creepy variation on the Oedipus complex. Of course, Oedipus, Freud kind of coined the term the Oedipal complex, derived from the Greek play Oedipus the King, written by Sophocles, where Oedipus unknowingly falls in love with his mother and winds up marrying her. And of course, that leads to a whole curse that he has to resolve for himself. In this case, of course, we have the daughter falling in love with the father, maybe because of Mary Jane Clairmont sort of separating the two of them or putting a divider between the two of them. But she tries to follow that lust that she has for her father by lusting after Percy Shelley, and that lusts her right into the marriage with him. Again, that's another pretty creepy taboo to go along with it. Now, they believed in a free and non-possessive love, and of course, Percy freely exercised that with his numerous affairs that he winds up having. Now, superstitious people would say, well, these people are messing with stuff that they shouldn't be messing with, so the end result is bad things are going to happen to them. And, in fact, the Shelleys wind up being surrounded by death, particularly their offspring. Their first daughter is named Clara, and she dies at 2 weeks old in 1815. Their first son is named William, and he dies roughly in 1818. And it's significant for two reasons. First of all, Frankenstein is published in 1818, and in the novel, there is a character by the name of William. So it stands to reason that Mary Shelley was probably writing Frankenstein while young William was by her side. Fanny winds up dying of a drug overdose a short time after that. Percy winds up drowning at sea in 1822. And besides having an affair with Percy, Claire also had an affair with Lord Byron, who was another poet that they all traveled with. And their daughter, Allegra, dies in 1820. And then in 1824, Lord Byron dies in Greece. So within a matter of 9 years, just about everyone who was following Mary Shelley around has died. Now, Frankenstein itself is published, well, it's conceived in the summer of 1816. And at the time, the poets were all gathered together in Switzerland. It was a very cold summer, and they spent a lot of the summer reading ghost stories. So Lord Byron comes up with the idea, hey, how about we write our own ghost stories? After all, we're writers and poets. Surely we can do as good as any of these stories that we've been reading. So they do. They all create these ghost stories. Mary is 18 years old when she sits down and starts conceiving Frankenstein. It would go on to be published anonymously at first, because women wouldn't write these type of stories in Victorian times, in 1818. Now, Mary tells us two different versions of how she came up with the idea for this particular novel. The first of which, she says, quote, that she had a dream that her little baby, I guess this would be Clara at this particular point, that her little baby came to life again, and that it had only been cold and they warmed it by the fire, and that life was injected back into it, and suddenly it was alive. Second version of the story was written in her diary, which was then published in the 1831 edition of the text, in which Mary says, quote, that she experienced a waking nightmare in which she saw the pale student of unhallowed arts create a living being from dead parts. And there's a pretty little rhyme in that. And you have to wonder, of course, writers are the biggest liars that there are, so somewhere between the two is probably the truth of where Frankenstein actually came from. Now, there are a number of different ways that Frankenstein can be read, and as you read the novel, keep some of these in mind and see what you notice and see what resonates with you. First of all, as I mentioned, it's in a science fiction class because it is a science fiction novel at its core. You have a man who engages in a biological experiment in which he goes around and he digs up bodies, chops off parts of them, brings them back to his laboratory, and puts it together, stitches it together, and zaps life back into it. It's a biological experiment that, for Victor Frankenstein, winds up going very, very wrong. The novel can also be read as a variation of the Faust myth, Of course, Faust, the story is told in numerous cultures around the world, is a man who sells his soul to the devil so that he can be in control of the world and almost every aspect of it, and each story puts its own spin on it. Of course, the devil comes along to collect his due, and then Faust tries to get out of the bargain. Victor, essentially, instead of selling his soul to the devil, he sells his soul to science. And in doing so, the creature, the created, comes back to the creator and looks for the proper atonement, and then Victor tries to get out of it. So there's a variation of the Faust myth within that. Of course, Victor is trying to be a god. He wants to create life. So what we have here is a disease creation myth, in which God, aka Victor, creates life, aka Adam and Eve, and of course, the created wind up being disobedient. They don't follow the rules. But it's disease because while God lays down the rules for Adam and Eve, Victor does no such thing. He runs away from the creature and allows it to try to figure out how to live in the world on its own. And of course, it ends badly for everyone. Now, there's a number of feminist readings as well in this particular novel. First of all, Victor doesn't want to have a child the natural way, so what he does is he'd rather dig up body parts and assemble his own child that way and take the woman out of it. He's engaged, he's going to be married to Elizabeth, but he doesn't want to have children that way. He doesn't see that as being creating life because he's not physically doing it himself on his own. So what we see here is the removal of the female from the creation process and replaced by solely the masculine being involved in the creation process. And it's interesting that, and appropriate, that the novel should be bookended by images of ice. Of course, ice is a literary symbol for infertility, contrasted with running water, which is a symbol of fertility. And it seems then appropriate that in between we have the elimination of the female from the whole creation process. So the sterility of the female that goes on throughout the course of the novel. Another feminist way that this could be read is that what Mary Shelley might have really been suggesting is that women sometimes don't want to have their babies. But in Victorian times, you just don't write that in a novel and expect the reading public to actually get behind it. So what do? You turn the baby into a deformed creature, and you turn the mother into a mad scientist. And the end result is that makes it okay, because now we have the man rejecting a creation as opposed to a woman rejecting a baby. And yet, perhaps that is the real intention going on beneath the surface, linked in, of course, with all of these images of infertility that dominate the text. Now, the other thing that we can read into the text is that it's a variation on the Prometheus myth. And it says right on the cover of the novel that it's called Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. And of course, Prometheus, part of the Greek mythology, he steals fire from the gods and brings it down to man. And the end result of that is that Prometheus is punished by the gods for the indiscretion. And Victor, likewise, is punished by his creation for essentially stealing the power of life from God himself. Now, Frankenstein is not the only science fiction novel that Mary Shelley wrote, and this is the last thought I have before we delve into our discussions of the novel. The Last Man is published in 1826, and it's a text that a lot of people don't even know exists. It's set in the years 2073 to 2100, and it tells the story of a worldwide plague that decimates the entire population of Earth, save for one man, Sir Lionel Verney. What Verney does is he takes and he writes down the whole end of days, and then he leaves the document on a rock, knowing that no other human will ever read it, but perhaps some other species or whoever comes next to inhabit the Earth will come along and see how the world itself wound up ending. Perhaps it's a little bit reactionary to the death of Percy Shelley, and of course there are some parallels with other people in Mary Shelley's life in the novel, but The Last Man and Frankenstein collectively together lead us to see that science fiction was actually born of a woman named Mary Shelley. And it's interesting that there's something very biblical and symbolic even in that. So now, let's take a look at Frankenstein.